Chapter 1: The Coming Darkness. Hello, Alex. I know it's been quite a while since we have spoken to each other. These days, I call myself Stephen NightCaller. I'm a bit of an odd fellow these days. Firstly, because I choose to be a PI. I set my own hours, but that's kind of an essential when you can't stand contact with sunlight. This brings me to the oddest thing about me. Unlike most people, who might have two parents from different cultures, I am something very different. I am half vampire. The rather odd child of an unfortunate girl and a vampire who just honestly wanted to get off. I never found out who I was fathered by. Now, 93 years later, I really don't care. Mother, unfortunately, couldn't bear the sight of me, not after she realized what I was. I bear her no ill will over this. I was born in 1927 in Berlin, Germany. This was a particularly bad set of circumstances for me, as my birth mother happened to be Jewish. It wasn't long before I found myself captured and carted off to some godforsaken concentration camp. The truth is, it was a slaughterhouse for humans. I could tell you the specific name and place, but in all honesty, it is something I try to forget. I was burned all the time back then. Thankfully, sunlight can't burn me to death, but it's still extremely painful even though I'm only half a vampire. I hid in any shadow I could find while I watched the misery of the dying humans around me. I'm sure you've already guessed that I had to survive by stealing blood from the dying. I had no idea how many prisoners I took a bite out of to keep myself alive. I only hope they forgive me, and I have put the life force I took from them to good use all of these years. Then, one night, one of the Nazi bastards grabbed me by the arm and dragged me out back of the camp with several other people. I watched in horror as a group of soldiers shot each and every one of the other captives. Then it was my turn at last. I was only 13 at the time, and cried and begged for my life. When pleading for mercy failed, I attacked them with all I had. Even a very young half-vampire is stronger than any human. I killed two of them before the third one put a rifle round through my knee. I dropped to the ground, screaming in pain, before the asshole with the rifle broke it over my face. I found myself looking into the face of the camp's commander. The bastard smiled when he pressed the gun muzzle to my head and pulled the trigger. I actually ended up lucky, which is a crazy thing to say given that I'm telling you of being shot in the head. I remember waking up with the worst headache I have ever imagined, and seeing the pale face of the Nazi bastard who shot me. His throat had been slit and blood dripped from the wound onto my face and into my mouth. I really couldn't think, but vampiric instinct made me open my mouth to drink the blood. The world began to make sense again as my head and brain healed. I looked up to see a pretty blonde woman holding the man by the back of his neck. She tossed the man away like a rag doll as soon as he stopped bleeding. I stood up and noticed that all the soldiers with him were dead as well. The woman picked me up in her arms and carried me away. I had no idea at the time that I had just met one of the oldest and powerful vampires currently known to exist. She accepted me as her son and cared for me as a doting mother. She took me home to meet her clan, the House of the Ebony Rose. That night, her clan officially adopted me. The adoption ceremony required that I consume a very large amount of her very old and very powerful blood. This always strengthens the younger vampire receiving the blood. In my case, that strength came with a lot of physical change. I grew taller and more muscular in a matter of moments. I went from the appearance of an emaciated 12-year-old to a particularly healthy and well-muscled 14-year-old. I was overcome with gratitude for both the protection and the power I'd been given. Her ancient blood also granted me a power I had never possessed before. I discovered that I could manipulate shadows at will, using them as gateways and even solid objects. She was quite pleased with my development, granting me the title NightCaller, which I currently use for a last name. It took me several years to realize who had really saved me. She's had many names over the years. She prefers to go by Sasha, though her current official title is Sasha, the Lady of the Ebony Rose. In 1941, I appeared as I do now, as a man in his early 20s. This, of course, drew the attention of Nazi recruiters desperate for soldiers. I didn't discover till years later that the vampiric blood in my veins had forever halted my aging in my prime. I managed to avoid fighting in the German army because Sasha and I typically devoured the recruiters. We did this because, obviously, a good army physical would have exposed the fact that I was abnormal. I had no intention of serving Hitler or his party. It might surprise you to know that Sasha was extremely upset by the extermination of the Jews and the general beliefs of the Nazi Party. I would have gone on a rampage every night and killed as many of them as I could. After seeing their horrible concentration camps, I really didn't consider Nazis human. Sasha, however, forbade me. She told me that immortals should not involve themselves in the battles of humans. She instead insisted that we hide as hospital workers. This worked out very well as we both had a fresh supply of blood that no one would miss. After the Second World War, we chose to come to the United States. Sasha had received legitimate medical training and was a certified MD by this point. I served as mother's assistant during those years when vampires were considered monsters and hidden from the world. I don't suppose it would surprise you to learn that working a 9 to 5 when you have vampire blood is very difficult. The mandatory avoidance of sunlight as well as the inability to sleep at all during the night make it near impossible to be around humans without being found out. The two of us worked the hospital's emergency rooms during the night shift. 35 years is a long time to do anything, and serving as mother's orderly grew boring and unfulfilling. The upside of it is I became quite the expert on people. It was, of course, necessary for us to change hospitals and identities every few years. Our lack of aging would have been noticed otherwise. I still remember the night it all changed. I was sitting alone with Sasha in her office having a drink. We had cleverly come up with the idea of mixing pureed strawberry and raspberry in with blood in order to hide our unusual dietary needs. Sasha kept the radio in our office for entertainment while we took our breaks. Then a newscaster began talking about vampires. Both Sasha and I laughed. Fictional vampires are quite amusing to real vampires because of how much they get wrong. I still snicker a bit when I remember the first time I saw Bela Lugosi. When the radio broadcast repeated its call letters as FCC regulations require, we both stopped laughing. It was CBS News. The newscaster went on declaring vampires to be real, outing not only our secret, but the secrets of werewolves and other common non-human races. This is terrifying for both of us as well. Vampires are powerful, but at the time we were very few in number. Vampires finding their way into the human world at that time was more a function of luck than any kind of purposeful act. The boundary between worlds grows thin at certain times in certain locations. If an individual is in the right place at the right time, they can walk through even without knowing it. This also means that back then it was near impossible to return. Humans also found their way into the dark world. A great many of them didn't survive, but a few live in peace with the native inhabitants. The newscaster was describing something a lot more than this. He was describing a literal gate. The way he described it, it sounded rather like a hole in reality. At that time, I had never been to the other side of the portal and had never seen the world from which vampires come. All I knew about our supposed homeland was what Sasha had told me. Some teenaged kids inspired by Aleister Crowley were playing around with old spellbooks and had actually managed to create a stable doorway into the dark world and enter it. Miraculously, they managed to not be eaten in the process by either one of my kind or something else that preys on humans. It was pandemonium in the streets as the U.S. Army mobilized and invaded the portal. Non-humans were attacked on sight and fought back. The extreme paranoia generated by the fear of vampires forced Sasha and I, along with the rest of our clan, to go underground for 3 years. I won't bother to explain how I didn't die of thirst during that time, but there are other things in the city to get blood from other than humans, after a great many deaths on both sides. The same teenagers and a few other occult experts brokered a deal between the beings of the dark world and the human race. Ironically, it wasn't the treaty or great leaders that brought human and non-humans together. It was the power of capitalism. A few of the wealthy got an idea to hire non-humans as entertainment. This quickly became all the rage, and soon enough, it became common practice. Within 10 years, magic and the supernatural powers of non-humans became hot commodities. The rest, as they say, is history. 10 years later, non-humans were granted human rights. I approached Mother Sasha immediately for her blessing on finding myself a career. I explained to her that it wasn't that I wanted money, it was that I wanted to have a career for myself. To my surprise, she was very understanding and smiled warmly. After several attempts at various night jobs, I settled on a private eye. I could choose my own hours and be my own boss. It turned out that having superb senses and the ability to use shadows as doorways are both very useful abilities for a private eye. Sasha offered to bankroll the whole thing. For Sasha, the money to start a small business was nothing to her. Like most vampires, she had centuries to accumulate wealth. She always tells me that wealth is fun for a while, but it eventually gets boring. I refused her money. I wanted to do it for myself. She accepted my answer, but did not want to at least give me something as a token of support. She allowed me to pick from the old office furniture and such that we had accumulated over the years. She had many things that were worth a small fortune and belong in a museum. I didn't want anything too expensive, so I simply took my favorite things from the 1940s. I thought my office looked great. I was a little embarrassed when my first client asked if I was a big Dick Tracy fan. When I told Sasha about it, she just laughed and said that most vampires got stuck in a time. If you're wondering, yes, my office still is full of the same old stuff plus a laptop. The fact is that whether my fashion sense was out of date or not, I still became quite a famous detective. It turns out that my unusual parentage makes me the popular choice for settling disputes between humans and non-humans. Vampires trust me because of the vampire blood I carry. Humans trust me for the exact opposite reason. Well, anyway, Alex, now that we've caught up, I'm writing you to speak with you about a current case. This case began in a rather unorthodox way. After another of Mrs. Muir's investigations into her husband's free time activities, she constantly believes that he cheats on her. I have no idea why she believes this, as I have investigated him exactly 17 times and never found any evidence that he has a mistress. The 18th attempt was nothing different. I stepped into the alley outside my office and melded myself with the shadows, allowing my body to become incorporeal, and I moved through shadows to his location. It took a few tries, but I finally found him at a writing club outside the city. I heard him say into his cell phone, "Have Clarice ready, I'll be there shortly." I was so astonished I almost fell out of the tree I was hiding in. I continued to follow him into the writing club, moving from shadow to shadow. I kicked myself the whole time, thinking I had somehow missed his mistress after 17 investigations. I kicked myself even harder when I saw Clarice. She was a beautiful blonde, a Palomino to be exact, and probably an Arabian. Clarice was beautiful, a beautiful horse.